The bustling downtown restaurant was alive with the sounds of laughter and clinking cutlery, an oasis of comfort amid the city's evening chaos. General Isaiah Brooks sat at a corner table, savoring his meal as he glanced around, occasionally smiling at the familiar faces of patrons enjoying their night out. The dim lighting cast a warm glow over the room, and the aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air, providing a sense of normalcy that enveloped him. He had just returned from a long deployment, and this dinner was meant to be a celebration of his homecoming, a moment of peace before rejoining the whirlwind of civilian life. As he took a sip of his wine, he admired the artwork adorning the walls, abstract pieces that told stories of struggles and triumphs. He was lost in thought, reflecting on the sacrifices made and the friends lost during his service, when the tranquility was abruptly shattered by the entrance of a figure that would change everything. Officer Bradley Harris strode into the restaurant, his uniform crisp and his demeanor radiating authority. Known for his aggressive tactics and unyielding attitude, Harris had a reputation that preceded him. He surveyed the room with a predatory gaze, and his attention quickly landed on Brooks. Harris's brow furrowed as he approached, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise serene atmosphere. He wasn't here to enjoy a meal. He was on a mission, driven by an ingrained bias that colored his perception of the world around him. As he closed the distance, the laughter and chatter faded into a murmur, the air thickening with an unspoken tension. "Excuse me, sir," Harris said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Brooks looked up, his brow creased in confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite yet cautious. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time," Harris asserted, his eyes narrowing. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Brooks blinked, momentarily taken aback by the accusation. "I'm having dinner, officer. I just got back from overseas," he replied, gesturing to the plate in front of him. "Is there something wrong?" Harris dismissed Brooks's explanation with a wave of his hand, his prejudice blinding him to the general's dignity. "I'm going to need you to step outside," he insisted, his voice growing more authoritative. "I have reason to believe you're up to no good." The general felt his pulse quicken, a surge of indignation rising within him. "You must be joking," he said, incredulous. "I'm a decorated officer of the military, not some criminal. This is absurd." "Decorated or not, I'm the one in charge here," Harris replied, his voice cold and unyielding. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Now, please cooperate." Brooks's confusion turned to frustration as he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The nearby patrons had fallen silent, their eyes darting between the officer and the general. "Listen, I understand the need for protocol, but this is an overreach. I have done nothing wrong," he asserted, trying to maintain his composure. But Harris was unrelenting. "I don't have time for your excuses. You're coming with me," he barked, reaching for his handcuffs. At that moment, Brooks felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. How could this be happening? He was a respected figure in his community, yet here he was being treated like a common criminal in front of strangers who had once admired him. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "I demand to speak to a superior." Harris took a step closer, his stance aggressive. "You can talk all you want in the back of my cruiser. Now, turn around." The tension in the restaurant was palpable as patrons exchanged horrified glances, whispering amongst themselves. "This can't be happening," one woman murmured to her companion, her eyes wide with disbelief. As Brooks reluctantly turned, the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. The laughter and joy that had filled the restaurant moments ago felt like a distant memory, replaced by a chilling reality that he had never anticipated. Harris's grip on his arm was firm as he led him towards the exit, each step echoing the growing disbelief of those who watched, a silent witness to an unfolding injustice that would ripple far beyond the walls of the restaurant. As General Isaiah Brooks was led through the restaurant, the clinking of silverware and distant laughter faded into a haunting silence. Patrons turned their heads, eyes wide in disbelief as they watched a man of distinction, an esteemed general, being treated like a common criminal. The weight of humiliation settled heavily on Brooks's shoulders, and he felt an unfamiliar heat rise in his chest. Anger bubbled within him, mixing with the sting of injustice. He had fought for his country, yet here he was, bound in handcuffs, paraded out like a trophy for a police officer eager to prove himself. "Sir, this is ridiculous," he exclaimed, trying to maintain an air of dignity despite the degrading circumstances. "I'm an officer of the military. You can't do this." Bradley Harris, with a smug grin plastered on his face, tightened his grip on the handcuffs. "I can and I will, General. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe you should consider your choices more carefully in the future." Inside, Brooks's heart raced not just from anger, but from the deep betrayal of his own countrymen. As he was escorted out, whispers filled the air. A young couple sat at a nearby table, their forks frozen mid-bite. "Did he really just arrest him?" the woman whispered, her voice shaking. "Yeah, it looks like it," her partner replied, eyes wide. "I can't believe this is happening." Outside the restaurant, the cool evening air felt like a slap against Brooks's face. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in a shop window, the uniform he wore with pride now tainted by the disgrace of his situation. It was a striking contrast to the man he was, a man who had devoted his life to honor and service. How could this be happening? Back at the police station, the atmosphere was charged with camaraderie. Harris swaggered into the break room, his chest puffed out in triumph. The clatter of coffee cups and casual banter surrounded him as his colleagues gathered to hear about his latest catch. "I tell you, I'm tired of these people thinking they can just walk around like they own the place," Harris boasted, leaning casually against the counter. "I had them all figured out before I even approached." You should have seen the look on his face. Laughter erupted in the room, a chorus of approval for Harris's actions. "Nice job, Harris. You're doing us all a service." One officer clapped him on the back, nodding in agreement. But in stark contrast to the jubilation in the police station, Sarah Brooks rushed into the precinct, her heart pounding with worry. She had been unable to reach her husband since he had left for dinner, and a creeping dread began to settle in her stomach. Approaching the front desk, she called out, "Excuse me, I need to see my husband, General Isaiah Brooks." "I was told he was arrested?" The officer at the desk looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and indifference. "You'll have to wait. He's being processed." "What do you mean processed? For what? He hasn't done anything wrong." Sarah's voice rose, filled with desperation. "I need to see him now." At that moment, Harris strolled past, overhearing the commotion. "Ma'am," he interjected, a condescending tone in his voice. "Your husband was arrested for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was causing a scene." "Causing a scene?" Sarah echoed, incredulity etched across her face. "My husband is a decorated general. You have no idea what you're doing." Harris shrugged, the flicker of doubt not yet igniting in his mind. "You can take it up with the courts. He'll be out in a few hours." With a determined glint in her eye, Sarah took a step closer to Harris. "You may think you've won here, but I promise you, I will fight for my husband. I will clear his name and expose the truth behind your actions." Harris laughed dismissively, but as Sarah turned away, her heart raced with a mix of anger and determination. She could not let this injustice stand. The fight for her husband's dignity had just begun, and she was ready to do whatever it took to seek the truth, no matter the personal cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, General Isaiah Brooks stepped out of the police station, the weight of the unjust arrest still heavy on his shoulders. The cool evening air felt refreshing, but he couldn't shake the sensation of humiliation that clung to him like a second skin. He glanced at the news cameras flashing outside the station, reporters eager to capture the story of the man wrongfully accused. Brooks took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart, and stepped into the throng of reporters. "General Brooks, how do you feel after your release?" one reporter shouted, shoving a microphone in his direction. "I feel betrayed," Brooks replied, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within him. "Not just by Officer Harris, but by a system that allows this kind of discrimination to happen." The reporters scribbled furiously, their eyes alight with the drama of his words. Brooks pushed past them, his mind racing with thoughts of his wife, Sarah, and the distress she must be feeling. He needed to get home, to share the burden of this experience with her. As he walked, he could hear snippets of conversations around him, People discussing the incident, expressing shock and outrage, but also some who questioned his character, whispering doubts about his integrity. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Bradley Harris sat in his cramped office, staring blankly at a wall filled with commendations and photographs of his years on the force. The adrenaline from the earlier confrontation had faded, leaving behind a gnawing sense of dread. He could hear the murmurs of his colleagues in the hallway, their hushed tones filled with judgment. "Did you really have to arrest him?" one officer asked, shaking his head. "That was just wrong." Harris's fists clenched. "I was doing my job," he snapped, but the defiance in his voice felt hollow. Deep down, he could feel the cracks in his beliefs widening. He leaned back in his chair, memories of his upbringing flooding back. Years spent in a household where prejudice was the norm, where skin color determined worth. Was that really who he wanted to be? The following week, Brooks attended a community meeting, determined to turn his humiliation into a catalyst for change. The venue was packed with concerned citizens, eager to discuss the recent events that had shaken the community. As he walked in, the room fell silent, all eyes on him. He took a moment, letting the gravity of the situation sink in, before stepping up to the podium. "Thank you for gathering here tonight," he began, his voice strong yet warm. "What happened to me is not just an isolated incident. It highlights a deeper issue within our society: racial profiling and the systemic biases that permeate our institutions." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brooks continued, "I refuse to be a victim of this system. Instead, I want to be a voice for change. We must work together to ensure that no one else experiences the humiliation I faced." He could see nods of encouragement and hear whispers of support. A woman in the front row raised her hand. "How can we help?" she asked earnestly. "We need to educate one another," Brooks replied, feeling the fire of determination growing within him. "We need to confront our biases and hold those in power accountable. Together, we can create a movement that demands justice and equality for all." The meeting turned into a collaborative effort, with attendees sharing their experiences and ideas for mobilizing the community. Brooks left that night feeling empowered, surrounded by a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer just a victim. He was a leader, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. Meanwhile, Harris found himself increasingly isolated. The backlash from both the public and his fellow officers weighed heavily on his conscience. He began to attend a few of the same community meetings Brooks had initiated, sitting quietly in the back, absorbing the discussions. Each story shared by the community members pierced through the armor of his long-held beliefs, leaving him vulnerable and raw. One evening, after a particularly poignant speech from a local activist, Harris couldn't hold back any longer. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "I need to speak," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've been a part of the problem for too long, and I want to change." Gasps filled the room, but Brooks, standing at the front, met Harris's gaze with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Bradley Harris sat in the dim light of his apartment, the weight of his badge feeling heavier than ever. Plastered on the walls around him were reminders of his past glories, framed awards, photographs with colleagues, and a few token commendations that now felt tainted. He stared at the television, where a news anchor reported the latest updates on the investigation into his conduct. The image of General Isaiah Brooks flashed on the screen, a man whose dignity and grace shone through the storm of prejudice he had faced. Harris clenched his jaw, anger and shame wrestling within him. "Is this what I've become?" he muttered to himself, the bitter taste of regret hardening his throat. He reached for his phone, scrolling through social media posts filled with outrage against him. Each notification pinged like a hammer striking an anvil, forging his isolation deeper. Friends and allies he once counted on had begun to distance themselves, their silence louder than any words could be. At that moment, his phone rang, jolting him. It was his partner, Officer Jameson. "Brad, you there?" Jameson's voice was tense, tinged with concern. "Yeah, I'm here," Harris replied, his voice flat. "I just wanted to check on you. Heard about the leave and everything. People are talking, man. It's not looking good." "Thanks, Jameson. Really appreciate it," Harris said, though he knew the words rang hollow. "I wish I could do more," Jameson continued, hesitating. "You know, I always looked up to you. But you need to think about what this means. For you, for us." Harris nodded, though Jameson couldn't see him. "I'm trying to figure that out." The words hung heavily in the air, a stark admission of his turmoil. Meanwhile, across town, General Brooks stood in front of a small crowd gathered in a community center. The energy was palpable, a mixture of determination and hope. Brooks took a deep breath, his heart racing with the knowledge that his voice had the power to inspire change. He was no longer just a victim. He was a catalyst. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his deep voice resonating with authority. "I stand before you not just as a man who was wronged, but as a representative of every individual who has faced injustice because of the color of their skin." His words sparked murmurs of agreement among the audience, their eyes fixed on him. "I want to share my story," Brooks continued, recounting the incident at the restaurant with measured clarity. "What happened to me was not just a personal affront. It's a reflection of a systemic issue that we must confront together." He could see nods of understanding ripple through the crowd, and it filled him with purpose. As he spoke, he noticed a young woman in the front row, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're not alone," she whispered to him, and he felt a surge of gratitude. The power of community was alive in that room, a force that could not be silenced. Back in his apartment, Harris turned off the television, his mind racing. He recalled Brooks's dignified composure, a stark contrast to his own spiraling thoughts. The general had transformed humiliation into a mission, rallying people to confront the very prejudices that had ensnared Harris in a web of ignorance. The realization stung. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand, a game that had real consequences for real people. Just as he was about to drown in self-pity, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from an anonymous sender, a screenshot of a tweet that read, "Justice will prevail. Hashtag Isaiah Brooks." Harris felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The tide was turning, and he was on the losing side. Meanwhile, Brooks was not just speaking. He was igniting a movement. People were beginning to share their own stories, their own experiences of racial profiling and discrimination. The community rallied around him, their voices rising in unison. "We will not stand for this," a man shouted from the back, and the room erupted in applause. As the meeting concluded, Brooks stepped outside to a gathering of supporters, reporters, and cameras. He felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. This was not just about him anymore. It was about paving the way for change. Together, we can create a future where our children won't have to live in fear, where justice isn't a privilege but a right, he declared, and the crowd cheered, their voices echoing against the walls of the community center. As Harris reflected on Brooks's transformation, he was filled with an unsettling mixture of admiration and envy. He had once believed himself to be the protector, the enforcer of law, yet now he was the embodiment of the very prejudice he had sworn to fight against. The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in on him, each tick of the clock a reminder of the choices he had made. With a sudden resolve, Harris stood up, pacing the room as he grappled with the consequences of his actions. "I have to confront this," he said aloud, the words a declaration of intent. But how could he begin to untangle the mess he had created? What steps could he take to make amends? In that moment, he realized he had to seek out Brooks, not just to apologize, but to understand. Understanding would be the first step toward healing, for both of them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. A rally in support of General Isaiah Brooks was underway, drawing a diverse crowd united against racial injustice. Banners swayed gently in the evening breeze, emblazoned with messages of hope and solidarity. The media had descended on the event, cameras clicking and reporters eagerly capturing the spirit of the moment. Bradley Harris stood at the edge of the crowd, a silent observer amidst the throng of passionate voices. He had come out of a sense of obligation, a subtle push from his conscience that urged him to witness the unfolding of a movement he had previously dismissed. The chants grew louder, echoing the collective demand for justice. No justice, no peace. they shouted, a rhythm that thrummed in his chest. Harris felt a strange mix of emotions. He saw faces filled with determination, people whose lives were intertwined with Brooks's story. Yet, he felt increasingly alienated from his peers, many of whom had chosen to remain in the shadows, preferring to ignore the uncomfortable truths that were being laid bare before them. As he crossed his arms, he caught snippets of conversations around him, each one amplifying his sense of disconnection. "Can you believe what he went through?" a young woman said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's not just about him. It affects all of us." Harris shifted uncomfortably at the thought. Just weeks ago, he had been the one enforcing the very prejudices that these people were rallying against. The shame was suffocating, but an unexpected voice broke through his internal turmoil. "Thank you all for being here today." General Brooks's voice rang out, steady and resolute as he took the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of support that washed over him. Brooks looked out at the sea of faces, his own expression a blend of gratitude and determination. "I stand before you not just as a victim of injustice, but as a testament to the strength we have when we come together," he began, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about one man's experience. It's about the countless others who have faced similar trials and tribulations. It's about the fight against a system that has long perpetuated inequality." Harris's heart raced as he listened. Brooks's words were powerful, cutting through the layers of denial he had built around his beliefs. He felt an urge to step forward, to confront the biases he had held for so long. "Change starts with us," Brooks continued, gesturing toward the audience. "We must hold ourselves accountable, educate ourselves, and ensure that justice is not just a concept, but a reality for every individual, regardless of their race." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Harris found himself clapping along, his mind racing with the implications of Brooks's message. He thought about the moments that had shaped him, the prejudices instilled in him since childhood, and the choices he had made that had led him to this moment. As the rally progressed, he felt a growing sense of clarity wash over him. With every word Brooks spoke, Harris realized that he could no longer hide behind his badge, nor could he continue to perpetuate a cycle of hate and ignorance. He needed to take action, to confront his own biases head-on, and perhaps even seek forgiveness from those he had wronged. Finally, as the rally drew to a close, Harris made a decision. He would speak to his department, share his journey, and advocate for the changes that were so desperately needed within the police force. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him, but he understood that true growth often lay in vulnerability and honesty. "I have to do this," he muttered to himself, a resolve forming deep within. The crowd began to disperse, but Harris remained rooted in place, watching Brooks as he embraced supporters, a symbol of hope and resilience. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. It was time to confront not only the man he had wronged, but also the darkness within himself. The road to redemption would not be easy, but it was a journey he was finally ready to embark upon. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the city, the atmosphere in the hearing room was charged with anticipation. General Isaiah Brooks stood at the front, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared for this moment, yet the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. The room was filled with community members, journalists, and representatives from various civil rights organizations, all eager to hear his testimony. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he approached the microphone. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," Brooks began, his voice firm despite the tremor of emotion underlying his words. "What happened to me that night wasn't just an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a systemic issue that has plagued our society for far too long." He paused, glancing at the faces in the audience, and continued, "Racial profiling is real. It affects lives, families, and communities. I am here today not just for myself, but for every individual who has faced similar injustices." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Brooks felt a surge of strength. "When I was wrongfully arrested, I was stripped not only of my dignity, but of the respect I had earned over decades of service to my country. I am not just General Isaiah Brooks. I am a husband, a father, and a member of this community. My experience is a testament to the need for change within our law enforcement agencies." As he spoke, Bradley Harris sat in the back of the room, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. He could hardly recognize himself anymore. This was not the man he had been raised to be. He felt the eyes of the community upon him, some filled with anger, others with disappointment. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, ashamed to be associated with the very system that Brooks was bravely challenging. The hearing continued, and Brooks's testimony resonated deeply with the audience. His words painted a vivid picture of the pain and humiliation he had endured and the need for accountability and reform. It is not enough to simply apologize. We must ensure that policies are in place to prevent this from happening again. We need to foster a culture of understanding and respect within our police departments, he urged, his voice rising with passion. After Brooks concluded his testimony, the room erupted into applause. But the moment was bittersweet for Harris. As the hearings progressed, it became clear that the tides were turning against him. Witnesses recounted the night of the arrest, their testimonies weaving a narrative of injustice that left no room for doubt. The evidence mounted, and with each passing moment, the reality of his situation sank deeper into his consciousness. Days later, the verdict was in. Harris sat in a small, sterile office, his heart racing as he awaited the outcome. The hearing officer, a stern-faced woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, delivered the news. "Officer Harris, based on the testimonies and the evidence presented, you are hereby reprimanded and dismissed from the force. You will also face criminal charges for your actions that night." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Harris's mind raced as the implications of his actions crashed down around him. He was no longer a protector of the law. He was a pariah, stripped of his badge and his sense of identity. Later that day, in an unexpected turn of events, Harris found himself face-to-face with Brooks in a quiet corner of the community center. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a palpable air of resolution. Harris spoke first, his voice low and filled with regret. "General Brooks, Bradley," Brooks interrupted, his tone firm yet compassionate. "What you did was unforgivable, but I believe in the power of redemption. Accountability is crucial, not just for you, but for all of us. It's a step toward true change." "I know I was wrong," Harris said, his voice trembling. "I've spent my whole life holding on to prejudices that I thought were justified. I see now how deeply flawed my perspective was." Brooks nodded, recognizing the struggle within Harris. "Acknowledging your biases is the first step. True change begins with self-reflection. It's not enough to just say you're sorry. You have to commit to being better." As they spoke, a sense of understanding began to blossom between them. Brooks received a commendation for his advocacy work that day, but he knew that the real victory lay in the potential for change within Harris. "We can't erase what happened, but we can work together to ensure it doesn't happen again," Brooks suggested, extending a hand. Harris took it, the gesture symbolizing a shared commitment to a better future. "I want to help," he replied, his voice steady, with newfound resolve. Together, they stood at the forefront of a movement that sought to dismantle the prejudices that had long plagued their community, united in the belief that change was possible. If only they had the courage to confront their pasts and forge a new path forward.